The fight for Fallujah begins in Iraq, but even if Daesh is flushed from the city, will it lead to lasting peace? Also on today's program, slam the door shut or open criminals up to rehabilitation. We debate whether punitive sentences are out of date. And in picture this, a huge strike cripples France. Thousands protest against controversial labor reforms. Hello and welcome to the Newsmakers with me, Imran Garda. If history is anything to go by, then the Iraqi military, with the help of the US, will feel confident it can overcome Daesh in the city of Fallujah. This is the third time since 2003 that Sunni militants have seized the city, and the third time that the US and its allies have gone into battle to retake it. But even if they're successful, as they have in the past, will the bombs and bullets really fall silent? Or does history threaten to repeat itself for a fourth time? The city's largely Sunni population has repeatedly been isolated by the Shia-led government in Baghdad, and resentment could once again lead to a rise in violence. Today's Newsmaker is the city of Fallujah, as we ask what needs to be done to secure long-lasting peace.
0 hour for the liberation of Fallujah has arrived. The moment of great victory has drawn near, and Daesh has no choice but to flee.
Tens of thousands of fighters are trying to retake one of Iraq's most strategic cities. Shia militia groups and Sunni tribes are also involved in the operation against Daesh. They first captured the nearby town of Gama, about 15 kilometers to the northeast, while Iraqi and US-led coalition aircraft have been pounding Fallujah and surrounding areas.
We had intense fighting against the extremists in this area, and they suffered huge losses.
The latest chapter in Fallujah's bloody history began with the American withdrawal from Anbar province in 2011.
But we're leaving behind a sovereign, stable, and self-reliant Iraq.
The truth was markedly different. Fallujah was taken by Daesh in 2014, and now the scenario is changing again. The strategic value is clear. It's only 60 kilometers from Baghdad along the Euphrates River. It controls the main highway to Jordan and Syria. The presence of Daesh is a constant threat to Baghdad and a thorn in the side of the Iraqi government of Prime Minister Haider al-Abadi. He's under pressure to show he can deliver not just security, but also political reform. Fallujah is a city home to tens of thousands of civilians. There have been calls by the security forces for the population to leave, so far not heeded. But this is a place used to siege and warfare. It's the third time since 2003 that US and Iraqi forces have fought to retake Fallujah. The question may not be whether they'll regain control of the area, but whether it will finally matter. Francis Collins, The Newsmakers.
Well, joining me now from Washington, D.C. to discuss the fight to retake Fallujah is Senior Future of the War Fellow at the New America Foundation and retired U.S. Army Lieutenant Colonel Douglas Ollivant. Doug, thanks for joining us. You have about 20,000 Iraqi soldiers, plus you have the extra Shia militias, helped by U.S. soldiers, only fighting against plus minus 1,000 Daesh fighters. So that doesn't seem to be a difficult fight. Will it be a difficult fight?
Well, I think it will be simply because Daesh has had so long to prepare this ground. Fallujah is effectively now a minefield. And even if no one is shooting at you, you still move very, very slowly when you move through a minefield. And of course, people are shooting at you. So even given these overwhelming numbers, you're right, the outcome is not in doubt. You know, there are 20,000 on one side, there are 1,000 on the other. We know how this story is going to end, but it still could take some time.
Now, you have the popular mobilization units, Hashd al-Sha'bi, the Shia militias. In the past, they've committed terrible atrocities against Sunnis who had nothing to do with ISIS, except for the fact that they were Sunnis living under ISIS, and maybe some of them were sympathetic. They've come out and said that, no looting, no hostages, no torture, basically no retribution against Sunnis who lived under ISIS. Should we believe them?
Well, certainly there's a lot of pressure on them. As you know, Grand Ayatollah Sistani has reiterated that he expects good behavior, that there should be no looting, that there should be no atrocities. But war is war, and I'm sure something is going to happen. The question is, does it happen on a mass scale, or are these isolated incidents that can be found and prosecuted, but don't question the integrity of the whole process?
Yeah, and one of the reasons I ask this is because this is so soon after that spate of suicide bombings in Baghdad, which seem to exclusively target the Shia. Are we on the verge of more sectarian killings in general?
Well, certainly, as we all know, Daesh is a genocidal organization. They are explicitly trying to kill Shia and Yazidis and Christians and other smaller groups, but mostly Shia, given the numbers involved. So that's their aim. It is incumbent on the Iraqi government to keep calm and try to make sure that the solution is inclusive. That said, that is a very hard lift.
As a military man, help me understand how the Fallujah offensive will differ from the Raqqa offensive.
Well, they're very, very different. In Fallujah, you have legitimate government forces, and even if the bulk of them are Shia, they are fighting under the Iraqi flag, under a Sunni Iraqi Minister of Defense. We've seen him out there personally on the battlefield supervising. And it's right there, it's close, and they have the forces to take it, and there are a significant number of Arab Sunni forces involved with whom the population will sympathize. As you know, in Raqqa, we have almost none of these things. There is no government. It's a collection of militia forces, and unfortunately, the bulk of that force is Kurdish, and it's unclear how the Sunni Arab citizens of Raqqa will accept a Kurdish force, largely Kurdish force, coming to liberate them.
If Daesh is smashed in Fallujah, would the next step then be Mosul?
I think so. Fallujah is pretty much the last place in Anbar that needs to be liberated. We've had several victories all the way out in the western end of Anbar, very close to Jordan and Syria. So this city is really the last piece of Anbar to fall. There'll be a little bit of mopping up, but it's the last big piece. And then the last big thing to liberate in Iraq will be Mosul.
Now, something that just came out in the past few hours from multiple sources, and it seems legitimate. I've seen pictures of these U.S. soldiers helping the Iraqis wearing YPG patches. That's the Syrian wing of the PKK. Turks here are looking at these pictures going, this is a group that set off suicide bombs in Ankara, and you have U.S. soldiers wearing YPG patches on their shoulders. What's up with that?
I've not seen these pictures, so I can't comment on their authenticity. If so, that is either a policy problem or a discipline problem. Either someone needs to figure out at a macro level that while we may have to work with the YPG, affiliating with them is something else altogether. My guess is it's not a macro problem, it's a micro problem, that you have some soldiers on the ground who have made friends with the YPG and are just throwing their patches on out of solidarity, and that needs to be fixed.
Okay, Doug, always good to talk to you. Douglas Ollivant joining us there from Washington, D.C. Still to come on the Newsmakers, why rehabilitation might be a better option than prison for many offenders. And in picture this, fury in France, thousands strike over controversial labor reform. For centuries, it's been common practice around the world for those caught committing a crime to get locked up, from stealing a loaf of bread to killing another man. The length of sentences has varied widely, but as prisons fill up and costs rise, some are asking if punitive sentences are even the best way to deter convicts from reoffending. Yvette McCullough looks at the approach of two countries.
It's known as the land of the free, with liberty given the greatest value. But the United States has the highest rate of people behind bars of any country in the world. The US spends $80 billion a year on incarceration. In 2014, the number of people in state and federal prisons was 1,561,500. 1 in 9 inmates in the US are serving life sentences, while the majority of those serving a sentence of a year or longer committed a non-violent crime, and around 50% of these are for drug offences. The US prison system is criticised for being overcrowded and having poor conditions. And studies suggest high levels of incarceration have little to no impact on decreasing crime, as more than half of those released in the US will be back within 3 years. Norway is known as a leading example of how incarceration can be humane and effective. Its so-called restorative justice is based on rehabilitation rather than punishment. Its prison facilities are described as the most luxurious in the world. Anders Breivik, who is serving 21 years for killing 77 people in 2011, successfully sued the government, saying the conditions in prison violated his human rights. In 2014, only 3,717 people were incarcerated out of Norway's population of 5 million, and it had one of the lowest rates of repeat offenders in the world, with only 20% of inmates breaking the law again within 2 years. But inmate numbers in Norway are rising. Its prisons are at capacity, and it has outsourced more than 200 cells to a prison in the Netherlands. So is this model a benchmark for countries to consider? And is rehabilitation, rather than imprisonment, the better response to crime? Yvette McCullough, The Newsmakers.
Well, joining me now to discuss this further is Baz Dreisinger, author of Incarceration Nations, and John Lott, president of Crime Prevention Research Center. Thanks, both of you, for joining us. Let me start with you, John Lott. Incarceration rates are up. The US has a quarter of the world's prison population. Is that worth it and normal for you?
Well, I think the reason why we have so many people in prison is we have a drug gang problem in the United States. You know, if you want to talk about how we should deal with drug gangs, then I'm happy to go and do that. But, you know, as far as private prisons, I mean, there's a reason why, whether it's private schools or whether it's private garbage collection or private prisons, if profits are on the line, people have an incentive to try to figure out how to produce better quality products at a lower price. I mean, there's a general rule that private provision of different goods cost about half what it does for the government to do. So, you know, if you want to go to have poor quality services and it costs more, then you have the government do it.
Okay, Baz Dreisinger, there's a drug gang problem and lots of people commit crime. That's why a quarter of the world's prison population is in US prisons. What do you think?
Well, obviously, I think I find that ludicrous. For one, the reason why so many people are in prison is because of the U.S.'s ridiculous approach to drug policy, because of systemic racism, systemic inequality that is funneling people directly into the prison system. When it comes to, as for private prisons, you know, they're not products, they're human beings. So I think the focus that we have to have is on how do we create a more just, a more equitable, and a more functional system. And we're talking about something like a 60% recidivism rate in this country. And the rates do not look much better elsewhere around the world. If any other company were operating on such statistics, it would be shut down immediately.
Baz, putting aside the death penalty, you would agree that there are some people who deserve being locked up for life, right?
I wouldn't say locked up. I think there are people who are not capable of existing in society peacefully and safely, and they would need to be removed, yes. But the conditions under which they would need to be removed would look dramatically different from a prison. The other thing I'll say is that that is the exception and not the rule. You know, people ask about mass murderers and such. That's the exception. That's not the bulk of who's in our prison. And so that's not the conversation we really need to be having. We need to be thinking about the mass of people that are being incarcerated in the U.S. and globally on relatively minor offenses and such.
Okay, but let me just finally follow up with this before I move on. What would you do with people who, for example, abduct kids, rape those kids, and then murder them? You would agree that they need to be locked up for life and punished, right? You're not trying to rehabilitate them, are you?
I think rehabilitation is always a possibility to be on the table. Do I think everyone can be rehabilitated or, frankly, habilitated? No. And there are absolutely people who need to be removed from society. But again, I don't feel that's the productive conversation to have, because that is not the bulk of who is in our prison system or most countries' prison systems. 5
years without parole for 5 grams of crack. Is that fair?
Well, I mean, as I said, I would radically change the prison rules for drug offenses. That may be one thing your guest and I agree on that. But, you know, I don't think that there's a racist component to these things. I think that what's happening is that these rules were originally put in place with regard to crack. I mean, I was there at the Sentencing Commission when these rules were put in place, was because there was a lot of violent crime in urban areas, and there was a call from people in minority communities to do something about the crack cocaine epidemic. Now, do I think it was a mistake, particularly looking back on what happened? Sure, I do. But you know, the question is, for violent crimes where somebody's harming somebody else, I think that prison is extremely important. You want to make it costly. You want to deter people from committing those types of crimes. And the notion that somehow reform is the way to go, that makes it less bad for these guys to be locked up, and you reduce the punishment, you're going to end up having more crimes being committed.
Baz, are you buying any of that?
Absolutely not. I don't even think much of this really is up for debate or question. I mean, the idea of the disparity in sentences, the racial disparity in sentencing between crack and cocaine has been shown time and again. We're certainly in agreement about radical, not reform, but overhaul in terms of our drug laws. That's certainly the case. And as for deterrence, I think if prison were deterring crime, then we would have a far safer society as it exists now. I mean, what is the 60% recidivism rate? Lastly, I'll say that the idea of violent crime, I mean, what gets classified as violent can sometimes be quite questionable. And the line between, quote, violent offenders and nonviolent offenders can be, again, questionable. As far as drug laws, we are seeing the repeal of all sorts of 3 strikes you're out laws all over the country. Here in New York, the Rockefeller drug laws. These are all being dismantled because there is widespread recognition that they were based on racial disparities and that they don't make any sense from a safety perspective and from a justice perspective.
Okay, John, even Bill Clinton said that he regretted the passing of the 3 strikes and you're out law. John?
Well, I mean, you have lots of politics that are involved in terms of people making decisions now. But I guess I just don't see the problem. If somebody repeatedly commits violent crimes, and I don't think that there's a hard time figuring out whether violent crimes occurred, whether one person has physically harmed another person that there's been physical contact and damage done to the other person. That seems pretty straightforward to me. No, but you said it's hard to define what a violent crime is, and I'm saying it's pretty easy to define what a violent crime is. That when somebody commits those types of violent crimes repeatedly, you have to ask yourself, do you really want to let this individual out again?
But you realize that's not who's being sent back to prison. We're not sending people back to prison who are repeatedly committing violent crimes.
That is question. When you're talking about the 3 strikes and you're out, that's exactly what the type of person you're talking about. They have to commit multiple violent crimes to be in that category.
Okay, but different states and different judges differ on interpretations.
Do you learn something?
Can I move on for a second? because I want to bring in the comparison with Norway, Baz, because you're a fan of the Norwegians. They have 75 people per 100,000 in their prisons. The US has 700 per 100,000. Why are you such a big fan of the Norwegians, Baz?
I'm a fan of multiple aspects of the way that they approach justice. There's something called the open prison model that's practiced throughout Scandinavia, whereby people in prison are permitted to come and go, maintain connections to the communities, and therefore have a much easier time re-entering society and maintaining their status as citizens when they come home and they've served their time. And it also creates safer communities. I'm a fan of their approach to corrections when someone is in an institution, even in a more traditional institution, in that it allows people the opportunity to genuinely be involved in this thing that we call corrections and genuinely enact rehabilitation. There are lots of programs, there's education, there's a whole host of rehabilitative programs that are doing incredible things for people on the inside that isn't happening here. There are relationships between corrections officers and the people in prison that are, again, genuinely restorative and rehabilitative, things that we might learn from.
Okay, let me then ask you about Anders Behring Breivik. He killed 77 people. He had a 3-cell complex. He was allowed to play video games. He had a TV. He sued the government and said that they're impeding his human rights, and he won. Is that the type of system that you want to defend, Baz?
Again, first of all, yes, but again, Breivik, who committed an atrocious, vile deed and will likely not see society again, is not the person we need to be talking about. He is the exception, not the rule.
But doesn't it tell us something about the system, Baz?
Clearly, we are... Yes, it does. It says that the system is committed to trying to rehabilitate everybody while recognizing that not everyone can be rehabilitated. The system is committed to keeping the community safe.
But it doesn't work.
Such that they're keeping him away from doing that harm ever again. And it says, but we're still recognizing the possibility of rehabilitation here. I fully support that.
John Lott, final comments from you.
I mean, I'm not a believer and fundamentally in an eye for
there
an
are 2
eye.
points to
And
make
I think
here.
that's what it comes down to.
Excuse me.
John,
Excuse me. There are a couple points to make here. One is, when you're talking about a maximum prison term of 20 years for someone like the mass killer that you just talked about, there's no additional cost for that individual whether he goes from 50 people killed to 77 people killed. You have to have something to go and try to deter these individuals. But beyond that, you know,
we already know multiple studies have shown that long prison sentences do not deter people from committing crimes.
Excuse me, that is completely false. There's tons of research out there. Did you read the academic research? Look, the notion that somehow if you make something more costly, more difficult, people won't, well, you're English, I know, that's not statistics. So in any case, you know, you go and you look at Norway. There's no evidence that these open prisons that they have on Bastoy Island, for example, which isolates people, you may not have, you know, walls there, but you have water around the island. There's no evidence that they have lower recidivism rates. You have self-selection. Who gets put into that particular type of
Norway's recidivism rate is about half of ours.
The question is, for those who go to an open prison versus because they have regular prisons in Norway, right? It's the question is, do those who go to this open prison have a lower recidivism? Look, you keep on wanting to interrupt somebody.
For one, the country's recidivism rate is about half ours.
Okay, John, final response. Okay,
no, but the question is,
also important.
Baz, if you don't mind,
for other reasons.
John, respond to the half the recidivism rate. Respond to that. Norway's is half of America's recidivism rate, and I'll let that be the final comment because I've got to wrap. Please.
What? Well, they've had a lower recidivism rate well before they had the changes in the prison system that were there. The question is, did the change, do those open prisons produce lower recidivism rate? Not just going, you know, because otherwise you're not explaining why they had a much lower recidivism rate before they changed the prison system.
Okay, I'll let that be the final word because unfortunately we are out of time. I've got to wrap. Baz Dreisinger and John Lott, thank you very much for joining us. In today's Picture This, pressure is mounting on the French government as workers at nuclear power stations and oil refineries go on strike following weeks of demonstrations over the government's changes to labour laws. Let's take a look.
Les forces de l'ordre interviennent depuis vendredi et continueront.
Today's Newsmaker has been the Iraqi city of Fallujah as we asked what needs to be done to push Daesh out and to secure long-lasting peace. Iraqi forces with US support have begun an operation to retake the strategic city which Daesh seized in 2014. Even if the military succeeds, challenges will remain to prevent Sunni militants from returning. You've been watching this edition of the Newsmakers with me, Imran Garda. As always, thanks for watching. Bye-bye.